Hello and welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to be talking about divisions or embellishment. This will be the first episode of maybe 4 or 5 episodes. First of all, I just wanted to say I'm sorry it's been a little while since I posted a video. I got back from teaching a workshop, and then several colds and illnesses went through my family. Kids were home from daycare, and I just wasn't able to sit down and record a video. So I'm really excited about getting this started. Now, before we dive in to the sort of mechanics of divisions or embellishments, let's talk about the goals of this little mini series here. I'm going to assume that you either want to improvise embellishments or divisions, or that you would like to compose them. There are a lot of opportunities in the repertoire to either add more embellishment to pieces that already have embellishment, and then there are situations where you have dances without repeats that you can add embellishments to. And we'll kind of discuss approaching it as an improviser versus approaching it as a composer and some different ideas on that. I do want to say that there are some maybe perhaps misconceptions about improvisation, composition, and preparing music from the 16th century, particularly the late 16th century. Today, because improvisation is relatively rare in the classical community, though that is changing, the mindset, especially toward the end of the 16th century, was that people needed to be more serious. They needed to be composers and thoughtful and making beautiful structures and things like that. So improvisation was very common in the 16th century. And as you get to the end of it, you start to see people talking about it as a lesser form of creating music. Now, to be 100% clear, I do not think that improvisation is lesser. I do not think that composing is better. I do not think that improvising is better or worse. I think that they're both wonderful ways of creating music, and we'll talk about maybe some of the different approaches you might take if you decide to do one or the other. And I do think that it comes down to your personality. I think some people, I have a friend who just hates composing because he doesn't want to be tied down. He doesn't want that to be the final answer. He'd rather just unleash what's in his heart, and then the next night he gets another try, and then the next night he gets another try. There's also this kind of feeling that, oh, if it's improvised, then it's a little more forgiving, right? If you mess up, you go, oh well, he messed up, but he was improvising it, or she was playing through that passage and maybe there was a better way to do it, but she came up with it on the spot. That was just so amazing. So what I will say is that I think improvisation is a wonderful tool for both improvisers who perform and for people who compose. Now, my tendency is toward composition. I spent a summer in grad school with a good friend of mine, Warner Ivorus, and we took grounds and we improvised over those grounds, and it was just a wonderful experience. But what I realized from that is that I'd have some idea that I really liked, and then it was gone, and then I had another idea I really liked, and then it was gone. And it was exciting, but I liked and maybe this comes from the fact my dad was a songwriter, and an author, and I've kind of gone that way as well, is that I like leaving something, I want to say, like, more permanent. Not that you can't record an improvisation, but I like the idea of like writing something out and there it is and it exists and somebody else can take it. Again, you could pull up an improvised solo on YouTube and learn it by ear. So none of this is actually strictly true. It's just a feeling. So some of you may find that you tend more toward improvisation, and some of you may find that you tend more toward composition. And some of you may decide, I don't want to have anything to do with any of this. I just want to play the notes on the page. And that is perfectly reasonable as well. So let's talk about some of the practical elements here. And I think this very first episode, what we're going to talk about are divisions where the original notes are kept in their time slot. So what do I mean by that? So if I play a C on a downbeat, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and I play an E on the third beat, a very simple division might be that I just put the D in between. So that's a third. So C to E is a third, and I'm going to fill that third with a D on beat 2. 1, 2, 3. Now we could get fancier. We could do something like, or, there's the sky's the limit, right? And you could do all sorts of things. You could make your way, kind of work it out, and we'll talk about some practical tricks for that. But basically, the original notes rhythmically stay in the same place. So C is on beat 1, E is on beat 3. I'm just filling the gaps. In the next episode, we'll talk about when some of the notes get displaced. So you can think of this first episode as being focused on 2 notes. Whereas in the second episode, because of the displacement, we'll actually be landing on the third note. And I'll explain that more in the next episode. But I think everything I'm going to say to the improvisers in this episode will be relevant to the composers as well. Because I think that improvisation is really, really, really helpful to composers. The difference is that a performing improviser is somebody who's memorized a lot of patterns and licks, and they've got a lot of options, and they've practiced it to the point where they can get up on a stage and do it in front of people. For a composer, somebody who's a little bit more like me, I'm sitting there and I'm improvising and I'm doing what I was just doing a second ago, and I'm going, well, do I like that one, or do I like something like that, or am I going to something like that? I'm going through all these different patterns, and then I'm testing them in the context of the piece and trying to find the best one, or the one that makes the composition work. So improvisation should be something that both performance improvisers do and composers do. And there's an interesting quote in CPE Box. I think it's the treatise on the true art of keyboard playing or something like that. I forget the title in English. But he says that you can be a good composer without being an improviser, but there's a much better chance if you're an excellent improviser that you're going to be an excellent composer. But I do like to break it down, because I do think there are different types of improvisation. I think there's performance improvisation, where you really have these well-prepared licks. And we're going to talk in a few minutes about some steps you can take. It'll be very similar to what I did that summer with my friend, versus a compositional improvisation style where you're really you're trying something, you toss it out. You're trying something, you toss it out. And you're trying to find as much variety as possible, and you're not worried about necessarily creating a cohesive whole on the spot. You're working on a spot, you're refining it. Some things that will be really, really helpful. Music theory, both in a practical sense and in a more kind of theoretical sense, will really, really help a lot. On the practical side of that, knowing the notes of your fingerboard is extremely helpful. Extremely helpful. So knowing this is a G, there we go to E, okay, B flat, right? Okay, here's another G, G, right? C, D. Being able to go around and find all of your notes, G, F, C. That way you're not sitting there going, where's A? I don't know what to do. And you can just find it. Some people, especially on the performance side of improvising, like to find patterns. There's the cage system on guitar. I know Cameron Wilkie is doing an article in the Lute Society of America quarterly on a sort of cage system for lute, which is really interesting. But there are a couple, especially when you're improvising or writing in a Renaissance style, there are a couple of things that we really need to keep in mind. If you're coming from a Baroque background or later, you may be used to thinking of pieces as being constructed in scales. So for example, I'm playing a piece in C major, My C major scale is going to be C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and everything in that piece, unless I modulate or use a borrowed chord, is going to be using those notes. It's a little more complicated with Renaissance music. There's something called ficta, and we'll talk about where and when sometimes people just ignore the ficta, because it certainly happens. But a great example is avoiding tritones against the bass. So if I were to look at, for example, a quadropavin by John Johnson, and the quadropavin is just a Pazzamezzo Moderno with a dance written above it. So the Pazzamezzo Moderno is a bass, a ground bass, and it's just C, C, F, F, C, C, G, G, C, C, F, F, C, G, C. When an F is in the bass, in general, we want to avoid playing B naturals. So what they would do is if you had an F in the bass, you'd play the B flat. So even though we're in technically C, you're going to be playing B flats whenever an F is in the bass. And so really what it is it's the seventh. And you might go, oh, okay. So what you're saying is Renaissance music uses Mixolydian scales. It uses, there's a flat seven, and that's all it is. No, because if you've got a G in the bass, you're using B natural. If you've got a C in the bass, you could use one or the other, actually. So it's very interesting. It's not a set scale like if you were improvising in a more modern style. Now that all said, I can find examples of tritones against the bass. Pietro Paolo Barono, all of his dances have tritones against the bass, and it kind of creates this rustic sound to it. I don't want to call it like simpleton music, but it just sort of has a rougher edge to it. So as long as you're aware of this and you're taking it into context, I think you're fine. But just something to be aware of, that seventh, if I'm in C, the seventh may be flat over the four chord or the fourth bass note in the scale. In C major's case, it would be F, right? If this is all going over your head and you're going, oh my gosh, what is Laudon talking about? That may be an indication that you should maybe strengthen your music theory a little bit. Go check out that link to Artusi that I've put out in a couple places, both in the book and in some previous episodes. I'll throw it back up in the description on this video. That said, though, you can start doing this without a ton of theory. You can take a piece in front of you and you can start adding some things. For those of you who want to improvise, I think one of the best things you can do, and this is what I did that summer, is find a buddy. And pick a couple different ground basses. The four big ones. You've got the Pazzamezzo Moderno, which I just played for you guys. You have the Antico. Which is nice because you have that minor one. The Romanesca, which is very similar. Can be done in duple or in triple. So for example, you can take the Pazzamezzo Moderno and you can go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. You can change the meter. And then the Bergamasca, which is just 1, 4, 5, 1. If you know your Roman numerals, you got and you can change the key. So, for example, you could put the Pazzamezzo Moderno in G. And you just change change the key, and that's totally fine. I would keep things relatively simple. Maybe just have a key per ground, and one of you plays the ground, and then the other person plays the melody above it. And one recommendation I make, or I'll make, because this is something I did, I found it very, very helpful, is that on the downbeat of each chord change, just land on the third of the chord, because in Renaissance music we're trying to avoid parallel fifths and we're trying to avoid parallel octaves, and it can be very, very easy to do something like this where you go, suddenly you've got these downbeat, octave on C, octave on F. And, we do get parallels in Renaissance music. And they're sort of, they create a kind of rustic, goofy sound. So they're used, but we want to kind of learn the rules first, and then know when you can break them and when you'd like to do that. So what I would recommend is that if your friend is playing, like, is playing the chords underneath and they're doing something, I would, let's say we're in a pazzo mezzo moderno, maybe the first measure you start on E, which is a little unusual. I know a lot of people in their counterpoint classes might be like, well, we should always start at an octave. There are plenty of pieces that begin on the third. So you can just start on the third, make it easy. And then what you would just do is make sure, okay, I need to land on the third of the next chord, which is F. So that's either going to be, you can do that, or depending on how it's being accompanied, or you can go up. So we end up with this. And then you're safe. You've got parallel thirds between each chord. So if you practice with your friend and you just think, okay, I just need to get to the third of the next chord, you can start working out these sort of different patterns. And I remember working out things that were just, going and doing things like that. So F sharp, getting all the way to the B, and it's a lot of fun to do that. Don't be afraid of repeated notes. I notice that people who improvise are often trying to like run up and down the fingerboard and change notes a lot. Sometimes it's really nice to just, some repeated notes can really add some interest. Leaps, things like that are really, really nice. So finding a friend, and if your plan is to improvise in front of an audience at some point, especially something from scratch, like let's say you get up on stage and you just say, hey, me and my buddy, we're going to be doing Pazzo Mezzo Moderno in C, we're just going to go. And your friend just starts going, and they just start playing, and you go, and you just start flying, right? And you start playing, and that's really cool. And I think that's a great place to start, both for composers and both for improvisers. And if you don't have a friend that you can play with, you can always record the grounds. It's not nearly as fun, and I don't think you get as much out of it. I think it's what can be really a blast is you go, okay, I'm going to do 2 rounds of the ground or 1 round of the ground, and then you switch. So your buddy's playing, they're doing the ground, and you're playing your melody. And then right at the end of it, you switch when the ground restarts. And that's a lot of fun because suddenly you're going back and forth between doing essentially the tenorista part and the treble part. Now, in terms of like how to start dividing and filling time, if you're looking at, for example, a piece of music in front of you and you'd like to add divisions to it, and this can be helpful as well in your live improvising, your sort of performance improvising as well, which is to have some sort of division between every single interval. And there are examples of this from the period, things like Ortiz and Virgiliano making these sort of lists of how to divide an interval. They don't work so great on the lute. They don't sound so great if you use those specific divisions. So what I would recommend you do, and in fact, I think this whole process is better if you do most of the work. Like I could write out a sheet for you guys and you could memorize it, but I think part of the process of becoming an improviser, becoming a composer, is actually creating these things yourself. So what I'll do is, I one of the things you could do today after watching this video is you sit down and you go, okay, what's the simplest interval? Unison. 2, 3, 4. And what's the simple? I mean, pick something really, really stupid simple to do at first. And you go, oh, well, with the unison, I could just repeat it. I could go 1, 2, 3, 4. There you go. You could have done something like gone below or gone above. 1, 2, 3, 4. But it's nice to have that. Just start with the simplest thing possible. If you have the next interval, let's say a second, 2, 3, 4, you might go, okay, what am I going to do? Well, you could repeat one of those notes. You could go G, G, like that. You could go from underneath, from above. You could go anticipate, play the A twice as you go ahead. But what I would do is for each interval, have one way to fill the gap. And just really start to ingrain that. So wherever you see a third, it might just be, so here's that C to E that I did at the beginning of the video, right? So let's say you're playing a piece and it's an unornamented dance and you see 1, 2, 3. And you go, okay, there's a third. I'm just going to fill it in. 1, 2, 3. And that simple way, if you're a beginner, that's a great way. You just put the D in between. If you're a little more advanced, maybe you do something like, or something like that, where you add a little more flavor. There's a lot of different ways, but I'd find one way for each interval. You know, let's say we're going up a fourth, so we go F, G, D, 4. Now, if that's going to be on beat 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and then we've got to double the speed, right? So we go 1, 2, and 3, 4. We got to fill in that time correctly, because the rule for this episode is that we're going to keep the notes exactly where they're at in time. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about another common practice between 3 notes. So, for example, I have a passage that goes 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And then I might do something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. So I moved that B flat to the 4th beat. Don't worry about that for now. We'll talk about that in the next episode, displacing some of the notes and it still being a form of embellishment. So, if you are interested in composition, if you are interested in improvisation, maybe the first thing I would do tonight is sit down and take each of the intervals and find a way to fill it. It's nice to have a version in duple, and it's nice to have a version in triple, and it's nice to be flexible. So, for example, if I wanted to fill, I've been giving examples that are like 1, 2, 3, which is really convenient because if the piece is in 3, that works. If the piece is in 4, that works. That's great. But let's say the interval is occurs between beats 1 and 2. 1, 2. Well, then you just double the speed. 1 and 2, right? Now, you won't necessarily have time to fill in some of the more complicated things, but you do. You could do something like 1 and a 2, 1 and a 2. Let's see, 1 and a 2, 1 and a 2. There you go, 1 and a 2. You could just do something real. I'm trying to come up with something very fancy, and it's like, just do this, Laudon, and a 2. There. You could fill that gap with faster notes. So figure out flexible ways to fill the gaps. And I think, honestly, when you're first starting, the easiest thing is like if it's a third, you put the D in between. Let's say it's C to F, well, D. You put these 2 notes. And if it's between beats 1 and 2, 1, 2, you go 1, just like that. 1. And I think that, or you could Lombard it, right? 1 and 2 and that could be the variety you do, but just keeping it super, super simple. Obviously, when you get to something like an octave, you may find that you don't have space to fill in all the notes, right? You may go, okay, if this is on beat 1 and this is on beat 3, and I go 1 E and 2 E and, well, that's nice, right? You could go 1 and a 2 E and a 1, okay? Or you have the long note at the end, 1 and a 2 E and, or we go 1 and a 2 E and a 1. Oh, I see. 1 E and a 2, 1 E and a 2 E and 1. You could do something like that. 1 E and a 2 E and 1. And then you're set, right? You can have the 8th note at the end. You could have it at the beginning. You could do something like 1 E and 2 E and 1 E and 2. Let's see. 1 E and 2 E and 1 E and 2 E and. Yeah, you could do something like that too. Play around with the timing, mess around with it. You could tell I'm a composer. I'm going, oh, I don't like that as much as this. I don't like that as much as that. But as an improviser, you can do the same thing tonight, which is figure out what you like, and then you ingrain it. So let's say, for example, that I do my composer thing and I sit and I go, okay, well, 2 E, so we got 1 and a 2 E and 1 and a 2 E and a 3. Okay, great. I like that one a lot. Now I need to be able to do that on as many different notes as possible. So that was C to C. So I go, then I do F to F, right? Or I do G. And with slightly different notes. So that was, sort of a G minor. And I may want to also do that with the F sharp. Something like that. Depending on the context, you may be using different notes. As we talked about with the ficta, depending on what's going on in the bass, you may be playing something slightly different in terms of the scale or in terms of the run. So being flexible is a really good idea. So to summarize, for this very first episode, what I would do tonight is sit down, make a list of the intervals, unison, second, third, and it doesn't really, I know there's minor second and major second, but if you think about it, you're going to be doing the same thing, right? Because it's divisions. You're going to be going, okay, so I need to go from G to A, all right, or G to A flat. The division is going to be somewhat similar, right? You hit G twice, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1 and a 2, right? Or 1 and a 2, and it just depends. You can use the same style of division or embellishment. That would be the first thing that I would do. I'd sit down tonight and just come up with a list, and then while you're playing your solo pieces, you can just start filling in wherever you want. And it's not always going to work. It's not always going to sound good, but you just kind of on autopilot, you put in that little lick, that little division that you've memorized. And then obviously what you could do then is learn another set. So you have two options. So for example, if you learned this, then you could go, okay, those are my two. And then eventually you go, oh, okay, I want, there's a third, there's a fourth, okay, and then I've got, you start adding different options so that when you run into it in the music, you can fill it out. And if you're a continuo player, you may have already done some of this with your tags. So for example, continuo players will put little linking melodic fragments between different chords. And in some ways this is very similar. You kind of come up with your list that you like doing, and you learn to do them in a bunch of different keys, and then you're set. But I think the thing that's really, really fun is you find someone to play some grounds for you. And then you go, okay, well, Laudon, you said to me that I'm going to begin each chord with each measure of the ground with the third above the bass. So if I'm in my Pazzo Mezzo Moderno, I'm going to end up with E, and then I'm going to go to A, and then I'm going to go to E, and then I'm going to go to B, and then I'm going to go to E, and then I'm going to go to A, and then I'm going to go to E, B, and then end on the octave, right? There you would end on the octave for the very last chord, unless you're continuing on. And then you go, okay, well, then I guess what I need to do is I need to learn those intervals. So, for example, if I'm doing this, I have to go E to A. Okay, so I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. And there we go. I've landed on my thirds, right? And it's not exciting. It's not necessarily super interesting, but I think if your plan is to eventually perform and improvise, it's actually a really good idea to start with really boring things and just get super, super comfortable with those thirds. And you can obviously make them much more interesting later, right? If I'm going to go 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, something like that, right? Whether it's in 3 or 4. I mean, I could have just done it in 3. 1, and 3, 1, and 3. You know, you could start adding some rhythms and make it a little more interesting. But keep it boring at first. Just think, okay, for your first session with your friend, I just need to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And I'm playing the ground and the treble above it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And you just slowly start sprinkling in some interesting things. And again, repeated notes are great. And you could just play around with that. You just 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 1, 2, and 3, 4, 1. And you just play around with it, and you screw up. You're going to mess up a ton. You know, if you're coming from this sort of classical background where you've got the lacrimate pattern in front of you, and you're going, okay, this note comes next, and this note comes next, and I'm doing this. It may take you a little while to loosen up. You might want to record the grounds before you meet with your friend for the first time and just practice, because you're going to do things like you're going to go, oh, okay, 1, 2, and 3, 4, and 1, and you're going to be like, I actually landed that. Oh, shoot. And then you're going to pause, and you're going to have to ask your friend to play again. And you're going to mess up, and you're going to mess up, and you're going to mess up. And then it gets easier. I think by the end of the summer, Warner and I were pretty comfortable. Like we had the 4 grounds and a couple different keys that we could do each in. And at that stage, we were mostly doing background music, but we were able to play for about 20 or 30 minutes and just trading back and forth. It wasn't brilliant. It wasn't, it was like going into a jazz club with beginning jazz players. But I think you can pretty quickly get going, and you can learn to do this. So in episode 2, we're going to talk about some other types of divisions where we displace one of the notes. So that'll be the subject matter then. I had thought about, again, making a sort of a handout and writing out division possibilities for people so that they could, memorize things like this. And I thought, it's going to be much better, again, if you come up with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little assignment for each of these videos. So your assignments for this video, again, are to create a interval list with 1 division between each interval. And remember, a repeated note counts. So, for example, if you're talking about your seconds or you're talking about your unison, you can just repeat the note. And then find a buddy to do grounds with. If you can't find a buddy to do grounds with, record some grounds for yourself in duple and in triple, and start practicing getting from the third of the chord to the third of the chord. And in the next episode, we'll talk about, well, we don't want to just go from the third to the third, right? I mean, that's not what Renaissance music does. And eventually we'll do some things like going from 3 to octave, maybe back to 3, or octave to 5th, right? We could go 2 and 3, 1, 2 and 3, 1, and you end up on that octave. It would have been better to do something like, Yeah, to go like that. So, if you find as you're doing it that, oh, yeah, there's a better way to do this, there's a better way to do this, or you might be a composer. But I can say this, when I'm writing a piece, I'm improvising a ton. I'm just sitting there and I'm going, okay, let's see. Okay, I don't like that. I'm going through and I'm trying different things out and I'm making sure that it fits in the context. So, improvisation, whether you end up using it on stage in front of people or not, is a really, really, really wonderful thing. And if you are a composer, I think it's essential. I think it's a wonderful thing to sit at the instrument and compose. We know that that was a common thing. More to come. Episode 2 I'll try to get out next week with some kind of I don't think you're going to accomplish everything that I'm talking about today in a single week. Maybe a month or 2 months if you've got a really a good friend that you can meet with and you can play around with. I might, in one of the future episodes, include a dance that doesn't have divisions or embellishments so that you can practice adding to them. I think that will be a lot of fun, especially toward the end of this series. The other episode that I have coming up, which I may put in as a little break, is a lot of people have requested having maybe some work on lower bass notes. So I pulled out my 10 course. I've got not a great 10 course, but I've been restringing it and refretting it, and I think it'll be at least good enough to do a lesson where I can show you guys some tricks and some studies and exercises and things to work on finding those low bass notes on a 10 course. I think what I'm going to actually do is convert it into a 9 course because it works for a lot of the repertoire, but the techniques will be the same. If you have any questions, any comments, please put them down in the comments section. As always, if you're enjoying the channel and you'd like to support it, best thing you can do is subscribe. I'll also put my Patreon link if you'd like to support me in that way. I did recently release a method book, which I'll have a link to that as well. That's going to get a big revision in the fall. And I'll kind of announce that when that happens. It'll probably be released early next year. I'm getting some great feedback and some looking at making some changes to make it even more approachable and interesting for students. Have a wonderful week. Happy luting and happy practicing, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.